processes that we can initiate as designers, so we can set them up, but they have a life of their own. And often, when a kind of certain system, in this case a forest system, reaches its so-called climax, it's 100 years, so, well, we're probably dead, you know? So you have to, I think it's very interesting when we start working in urban design and integrating forest systems. We also have to understand that it's got a life cycle. And of course, this is now done showing a more temperate forest. So this isn't looking at tropical forests. So what is the climax forest in different forest systems is a different type of tree, right? This is for one type of forest. But the idea, so the years change depending on the forest type. But the story is that anyways, you start getting a kind of system that is very long, a long time span, much longer than we're usually designing at the scale of urban design. So I think the more we start to include strategies for addressing global warming, we have to also think of the longer time span and to design across different say, phases. The word that's often used, that is used, say scientifically, in the kind of maturation and the growing of different vegetable system is succession. So it's where we have this system. So we can, again, it's not something that humans can force. We can kind of set up the conditions for natural succession to take place, right? But again, it always has its own, let's say, a certain life of its own, where a certain condition gives rise to new communities, new communities of plants, new communities of biospecies that all deal with conditions of soil and conditions of water. So I think it's just nice to know that we can try to design for succession, and understanding that often if we're starting to look for how to address the heat island effect, which I'll explain in a minute, often a kind of automatic pilot response is let's make trees, but often also trees don't immediately give you shade, and give you the cooling effects, because they need to mature, they need to kind of grow into being able to give you all the systems that it can offer. And of course, what's super interesting for us to understand is that once we initiate succession and we start introducing, in this case, forest systems in urban design, we're often doing it for the benefit of humans, but also, of course, more and more, and it's more and more spoken about, that we also have to start designing and thinking more for the non-human species, and understand how different species, whether it's birds or types of frogs or whatever, they all thrive. Different species, subspecies thrive in different parts of the same succession. So even though you plant something today, thinking it's good for this, in 100 years it might be a good environment for alligators, which maybe you don't know. So I think you have to understand that what you plant today is something that has a natural succession. Through the natural succession, and this is documented by landscape architects and ecologists, which species survive and thrive in which kinds of vegetal systems through their succession. So it's never a kind of designing for a moment in time, because these things have a long durée, a long moment of time. So that's a little bit the kind of short and sweet crash course in forest ecology. It's of course very complex, but just kind of key things. And why is that interesting to understand some of those principles? I think why it's interesting is if we start to see and start to understand the heat island. So when we have settlements, whether it's small villages or very big cities, we can have effect. So what happens is in an urban heat island is it means we have a system, and that in it is an island, so an identifiable that is much, much warmer than than the kind of sea around it, if you use the island metaphor now. So you've got an identifiable area that has higher temperatures, so it's higher urban heat than its surroundings. Its surroundings can be lower density urbanism, its surroundings can be, a village surrounded by agriculture, but often there are places where we congregate, again, villages or cities, have heat islands, and these heat islands are becoming more pronounced. And what are they caused from? So, a lot of times it's caused from the fact, very clearly, that we have materials that are absorbing heat, like asphalt and things like that, even building materials. We also have, in many, say, very warm contexts, we have air conditioning, right? So it makes us very cool inside. But if you go and measure the temperature outside an air conditioner, and not near an air conditioner, it's much higher because it's generating heat that's being expelled back into the environment while it's trying to keep us warm inside. So that's a major and becoming more and more problematic. We also have more heat that gets trapped in pollution. So we know in many countries in the world, I think Asia is still topping the bill, and I think India beats everything in terms of the amount of pollution in the cities. So it's quite alarming, and raising the pollution its particles trap heat, and also, of course, create problems of human health, particularly respiratory. So, and then we have kind of course more secondary things that we see around this kind of bubble. The important thing to understand is that it's scientifically measured that we have so in a kind of generic section of a more dense area that we have different temperatures that can be recorded across, say, a transect, and then also the difference of night and day. We saw last week how this temperature differential in some contexts, like in very arid contexts, that can itself be used, potentially, the temperature differential creates energy and can be used for cooling. We saw that the kind of clever system that was from the out of water book. But this temperature differential is not only, say, night and day, but it's also across the transect of the kind of where we have more impermeable materials, where we have more construction materials, where we have more air conditioning, where we have more use of electricity in general, so these kinds of things. So to address this heat island, or it's also called UHI, Urban Heat Island Index, or UH effect, UHE. So those are also words that are used. Is really often to let's bring in trees. Once we bring in trees, we can hopefully start to kind of dampen and adapt some of this kind of growing problems. One, of giving shade, of creating more place for, again, carbon to be sequestered, and to also deal, hopefully, choosing your right tree species with landscape architects and botanists, choosing tree species that also deal with, that can sequester more carbon, but that can also mitigate pollution to deal with some of these things. So I think this is the map some of you might have seen, but for me it's a really great map made by Richard Butter from the Atlas of the End of the World, available online, where he's kind of maps out at the scale of the globe projects that he calls global connectivity projects. And if you remember what we looked at last week, we also had the Great Green Wall was here, legislation, and with trying to, on the one hand, repair biodiversity, but also to deal with some of those heat island systems. Just to run through a little bit some historical examples, so those of you in the Palestine studio that went to the trip in Paris, you know it's not at least. So working with the notion of cooling and kind of natural cooling and a forest system as a kind of counterfoil to the city is not new. No, it's presently being, how would say, a renaissance as a strong driver, but it's not necessarily new. So this is Alpond, who worked, so the landscape architect who worked together at the time with Baron Haussmann, who was an engineer and a park designer. And of course, what's super interesting is as the city was being reconstructed by Haussmann, he was working not only with kind of an urban park system around the city, but also with two gigantic, you could say, green lungs outside the city related to the water system. So the Bologna and the Bois Vicence, together with other ones, and he was trying to kind of counter the ill effect of massive urbanization, creating a higher heat island, and also the cleansing effect that we can have. Never mind also the recreation and all that, but problematic, but in terms of already adapting to global warming, before it was even called that, this was part of the process that was being done. Here what's very nice to see, this is a map of Brussels. So Brussels, here is the Pentagon, so the historic center of Brussels. And what we see here is the Amazonian Wood, the large forest that's now a park, and which has shrunk significantly from what we're seeing here in 1706, when it was designed as a counterfigure and much bigger than the city, which is what's interesting. So it was considered a kind of essential. It was even called by some people like a second coast. So if you think of Flanders as a coast, but then this is a kind of coast or kind of edge condition of a forest that makes Brussels more livable. So again, 1700s. Berlin is, of course, super well known for this. So the foundations of the say, German Empire, and were basically set already by the Prussians. So before modern day Germany, when it was ruled by the Prussians, so in the 1870s, it was a very, very precise kind of policy, Prussian policy, to either through royal decree or through fiscal policy motivations, to make a system that we see the center of Berlin, and to have this incredible system of forest systems, and that's remained to this day a kind of very strong identity of Berlin. So on the kind of what you see in the bigger zoom out, so we've got the kind of center with small parks in it, and even here the Tiergarten as a piece. But very importantly, what's super interesting is that it looked beyond the city center, and it looked through a much bigger network, again, of how to understand this urban forest system as a way to kind of counter the effects of massive urbanization. Here we're looking in London, and again, London, of course, being much more industrialized, much quicker than some of the other places, certainly in Europe, but still having some open spaces, park spaces, forests in its core, but also having and trying to protect a great deal on its urban periphery. So this is something I actually take from Bianca Rinaldi, who presented also during the Metropolitan Park Seminar. And she's been doing study for quite some time in Singapore and Shanghai. So looking at, say, new cities, cities designed, Chandigarh, of course, by Koru, designed as a kind of new capital. And as much as it was a kind of radical modernism in terms of architectonics and the setting up of the system, it was also considered pretty radical in terms of its urban design story, where it had a whole system of forest fingers, had a very interesting system of the V, the kind of systems of hierarchy of different transport and park systems coupled. And then Singapore, of course, was part of the national, both of these were national identity projects, also nationalism, because you would say that the beginning of the state. So of course Singapore was with Lee Kuan Yew as a kind of visionary leader, jumping across kind of leapfrogging development that was already existing, kind of small, different ethnic groups, and kind of trying to bring Singapore into the world of the international network, and where he used massive urban development together with kind of image building that, if you remember, Bianca talked about very well in terms of trees. So Nehru in India was working together with Koru to kind of frame this system of Chandigarh. So new city, new capital, symbolic buildings, lots of housing, but also having its anchor be in landscape systems. And where, again, this kind of trees, these are again all from Bianca, the trees that were chosen, they were also part of the national identity building, but also really appropriate in terms of giving shade and shadow to this kind of piercing, tough heat. Similarly, in Singapore, we know that Lee Kuan Yew was really using the building of the global economy and transnational kind of headquarters that he wanted Singapore to become, together with a kind of very precise plan of forestry and then new notions of the city in the garden in the city, etc. So again, using, say, a system, one, remembering trees are good for carbon sequestration, right? They're good for the urban heat island, and in this case, they were also being very explicitly used to build a kind of urban or national identity. If we look again around to other places, this is Karlsruhe, a very interesting city in Germany, so along the Rhine. And of course here what's also super interesting is that, so this is part of the Black Forest, and the city was kind of built at this say, hinge, where the symbolic center, the Schloss or castle, was a hinge between the kind of forest world and the city itself. And you see it as a super, it's used as this kind of flip-flopping of the built, the not built, the natural, and cultural. And of course, what's happened over time, so initially it was, this is the city of humans, this is the place of the king, the rulers. And what's happened over time is parts of this forest has been eaten with clearings for development, at least keeping it of public nature, but still developing, somehow compromising, you could say, to a certain degree, this integrity, but still trying to keep enough big pieces that we didn't get the small scale fragmentation that you see. And it's never given over to kind of privatized development. Also, it's not kind of exclusive housing, it's sports facility, or it's more collective, at least it's collective programs. So if you're trying to justify why this might be okay, I wouldn't want to do that, but that's how you would justify it. I think what I wanted to show you here is Vinya, again, somebody who interviews, we had a tour of someone from the office. But he's considered really kind of key landscape architect in France, contemporary practice in a sense. And what I think is very beautiful about this diagram, which was designed for Greenwich together with his then partner, the now separate offices, Christine Delorme, is they developed, as landscape architects, they understand succession, right? And they understand growth, and they understand that you plant a lot of trees, and then you have to thin them, and some will die, and then so you can kind of predict what you'll get over time with kind of natural processes of some dying and man helping by feeding. So once certain species get to a certain moment. And what I think is very nice is also what you see in Vinya and many landscape architects when they draw natural systems, is that they show them growing. So if you look at the section, right? So the trees start out very small, they get very big, but you start out in the same section, you start out with, I don't know, 12 trees and you end with 3, you know? So that's, I think, also interesting for us. We're never going to be able to design that without the education of the landscape architect, but at least to understand the principles, I think it's something that's very nice to do. Just a few examples I wanted to run quickly through from around the world, and then I want to show you some other things from the forest privilege book in today's. But these are also it's a project in Desert Valley National Park, and it's where we understand that as a system. So this is a park path system, but as it moves across different biomes, it's also different. These are showing you different ways to make similar kinds of paths that work with very different systems. So if we look at the one in Canada, we look at the one here in Washington State, we can say we can design a similar wall, similar kind of line in a landscape, but the way it's going to act or react and simulate different kinds of landscapes depends very much on where you are in terms of geography and the different biomes. So we always, I think, have to know, and again, more examples that we see here. So the simple design of paths, which is a part of what we mainly do in urban design systems, we have to really understand how the path that we're designing, which is always an interruption in the system, how is it relating exactly to that kind of biome? How is it relating to a system, if we see here, of sitting lightly, not even kind of, not trying to break, but letting still life go under. So different systems of raising systems, and other ones where we know we create, again, breaks, we're creating fragmentation. And so what's the scale of fragmentation that we can, it's always a trade-off, when we fragment what would be a bigger area in the top one by West 8. Yeah, we want human access, but by fragmenting, we also lose some of its true, say, ecological potential. So it's always to understand precisely in which biome you are, so which landscape type you are, in order to understand how to intervene, even if it's something as simple as a path. So, what we do know is that a lot of policies today around the world are telling us that we can can start to use vegetation, particularly to get to solving things like urban, the CO2 dome that you saw in that initial image, urban pollution. So this is something where in policy now is starting to become much more prominent. Again, I think I told you last week, there's a very interesting woman, Rosetta Elkin, who wrote the book Plant Life, where she says we also have to be careful that policy doesn't dictate kind of mindlessly what we do in certain contexts, because sometimes it's not the answer. If plants, her argument is we shouldn't plant trees where they weren't before, because it might have ill effects. So this is the whole notion of understanding the long-running relationship of different cities to urban heat islands. Some cities have been designed explicitly. We saw Karlsruhe in Germany, Berlin, parts of Paris, on a big scale. This is the city of Atlanta. So when you think of a city like Atlanta in the American Southeast, you think of a hardcore, concretized city. But actually, again, if you zoom out, understanding that still it's having quite big forests they bottom around it. So it's also understanding these cities. Where do you have the heat island at which scale? And where do you actually have, where can you create urban design strategies across scales to address different issues? A well-known project, and there's many around the world, have been this kind of 1 million trees, 2 million trees campaigns. It's a very kind of soft, easy target for politicians. So to put on agendas, and then they make a big ceremony where they plant the first tree, and when the million. This is the picture of the 1,000th tree that finished the promise. So this was started actually in 2006 in New York, and there's been so many of these around the world. And again, super interesting, getting trees, particularly in kind of dense cities, dealing with carbon sequestration, dealing with the heat island. But again, I'd like to remind you that Rosetta Elkin says trees are much more than accounting. It's not just an Excel sheet. So a lot of factors play in. So actually, it's much better to have a big fat old tree than like, I don't know how many, but then a lot of little trees. So the size of trees matters, the type of tree matters, the species of tree matters. So she's always kind of a clever gauge of being critical to help us understand a bigger system. Again, this is a project in Madrid, an interesting project that was started to really, we know Madrid is a populous city. It's getting hotter and hotter and hotter. They're suffering a lot from disease related to heat, as they are in the contexts in Europe. But what happened here is they had a very interesting woman in the previous government, that's now out, so the project is out too. But the previous government that was going for a kind of massive system of reforestation. In the city itself is maybe not so much space, but at least in its periphery, where we have deindustrialization, where we have urban wastelands, etc. So she had this kind of vision to begin to look at the kind of metropolitan forest that went. So it was with 500,000 trees that would be spread across the periphery that encircles the city. I won't go too much into this, but this is divided into 5 sectors. This is the sector that Alde Holber did and Margarita lectured about. So long story short is there were 5 interesting kind of teams that worked on these different pieces of this puzzle. And a few months ago, they were all called into the yeah, that's a start up. So I won't go into this because I think you've seen it, and I show again an image at the end. But basically, what they did in Madrid, and you'll see some other images, is they've been previous governments, or say government interested in landscape and ecology issues a little bit more, a lot more left wing than the present city government. It was looking at how to kind of marry still redevelopment, but it is not a shrinking city, it's still growing, but how to marry kind of development together with kind of recovery of its ecological values. So again, these are drawings all coming from different teams, so different pieces of that puzzle. But what is also interesting is that, again, previous government, this was already in 2015. In Madrid, they also said, so this is actually before the Metropolitan Forests, is that they announced ways to build more parks in the city and to try to kind of free up vacant land and to find any kind of nooks and crannies where they could bring living plants back into the system. So which is very interesting, they started kind of taking some of the more hardscapes. I think Paris is obviously now doing this as well, taking some more of the hardscapes and piazzas, and turning them into kind of more vegetal systems. But also they started working, Ovaria, a very interesting engineering firm, started to work on these kind of living facades, how to bring vegetation into the buildings. I would say not in the way that they're doing in Milan, if I can be very critical, which I think is a bit superficial and considered more greenwashing than really engineering. They starting with Ovaria as engineers and working through an engineering process. Another, of course, big project of Madrid was looking along the river and a gigantic road. So, like many cities, they had a gigantic road infrastructure that was cutting public space and cutting the relationship of the city to the river. So it was a massive project that sought to kind of sink this highway under and to build over and create a new system, a new park. And basically 6 kilometers along the river, they sunk the roads and they started to develop, to reclaim the riverbanks for ecology. This was done as a team with Spanish architects and with 8 Spanish landscape architects. And this park, they put 8,000 pine trees and created underground parking in addition to the tunnels, and a kind of different orchard, so a cherry orchard in particular. So they created this, it's called Madrid Rio, and they created very, very different, again along 6 kilometers, so nothing so small, and created this incredible system of different atmospheres, combining, of course, the hardscape. You're still in the city center of Madrid, but using this kind of notion of bringing a lot of trees back into Madrid, creating this kind of being able to lower the temperature and create spaces for shade to escape the sun. So again, a massive project, creating new kinds of public space, creating a new urban waterfront. The waterfront had been taken over by roads. But I think also what's really interesting about this waterfront is it didn't commercialize it, as so many waterfronts do. When they say a waterfront is kind of cash cow, and just develop commercial junk. They really gave it to public space. Okay, it's a cafe here and there, but didn't turn it. They really turned it into primary thing wasn't public space. It wasn't a kind of commercial system. So it has a lot of different. And main trajectory of the 6 kilometers, that of course having kind of different armatures that feed into the tributaries of the rivers, etc., and different atmospheres and different kind of landscapes within the landscape to give space to different the skateboarders or the guys playing chess, and also different, creating along its long trajectory, a kind of continuity, but also a lot of difference. We have another interesting project, to just give you an idea. It's a project in Pittsburgh. It's actually a city where I initially studied for architecture. A kind of steel city. It's a very super industrial city, very interesting city. Most people would think it's interesting, but a kind of hardcore urban industrial city. With a very typical downtown concrete and whatever. So this is Chris Reed and his office space. So they had a strange site that you see in the plan that was crossing topographically. Pittsburgh is a city of interesting topography. But it's in the urban core. So it's in the urban core where there's not much space for things like trees and to grow property. But what they did is they created a connection between an upper and a lower plaza that was in the same section. One side into a hill, and they created a system of putting in as many trees as they can. But they also made it into what they call an energy forest. So as you'll see, they have trees, but then they also have these LED poles that give lighting and that are working by a solar lighting. So they combine a kind of super artificial tree trunks, which are actually poles that have LED lights, and solar collectors, which are kind of more traditional forests, to create a system that you then kind of, going from the high plaza to the low plaza, you kind of wander at a place between office buildings to basically have your lunch and to provide a kind of cooling space in the otherwise city that's getting hotter by the minute as more air conditioning is coming into things. So it's kind of very, very simple system. These places where the poles are set, and again with light run by solar energy. They're just these structures of steel cages and stones. So kind of very cheap, but bringing in a new texture also to the city. This is let's say a more zoomed out scale. It's an interesting group, it's a young office called Port Urbanism, Airports out of Philadelphia, and they call this a forest city. So they bring deforestation, again green trees front back where they were. So this is the city of Cleveland, so the American Midwest. And basically, as you'll see, they work along a river, and they create different forest and agroforestry systems along the river, and each different system supports a slightly different kind of urban structure. So again, they started to, so they combine a kind of forest structure and a productive landscape hand in hand with different forms of urban systems, and that when it's the most kind of dense new urban area that you see in white here, it's where you also have the bigger part of the forest interfering in it. And then what they developed is they developed a kind of series of transects showing how these different systems of different forms of urbanization work within the different forms of the landscape system. So they developed these as kind of a series of different types of transects or sections. And the idea is to really rethink, say, some of these brownfields. So Cleveland is part of this whole Rust Belt of massive industrial decline, and how to revive the river, but as a new system that's creating a cooler climate, more healthy climates now the whole notion of the city as a garden, they've been very frantically marketing that. And this to me is a quite controversial project, in the sense is it's really creating spectacle, it's creating artificial ecologies, but it does it kind of admitting that's what it's doing, no? It's based on the creation of artificial trees. So these gigantic things are considered trees. These structures, and these structures, what they call trees, but are not really trees, have within them a whole kind of high-tech system of monitoring the climate, of controlling the climate, of watering, so collecting rainwater, collecting sun, so trying to experiment with quite a lot of different technologies to be integrated into these trees. And then of course they create these gigantic artificial landscapes, artificial ecologies that are in these massive greenhouses. So they create these different kind of types of trees that do different things, that work with water management, and that store water and are able to use the water for the rest of the garden. And then they're also dealing with sun and cooling. So I want to then quickly go through, just because I think it relates a lot to the issues we've been talking about, just to kind of go quickly through some of this story that's, it came from a conference we had here quite some years ago, 3-day conference where we had one day about design, one day about science, and one day about policy. And the idea is that each day we had panels, and we thought we're all understanding each other and we're all looking to the same thing. Yes, but also speaking very different languages. Anyways, we then tried to put it together into a book where we invited a few other people that were in the conference itself. The book is published by Leuven University Press, and it's open access, so you can download it in high resolution on Leuven University Press. If you want. So I will show you basically a little bit of the 4 pieces. And for me, together with Ronald Mulder, we wrote a kind of opening essay to frame everything in kind of 20 points. But then we had 3 essays by scientists, so where they talked about the relationship of forest and science. Then we showed projects. Here we had the people in the conference, but then we invited some others to complement it. And then in the last part, these are actually more scientific papers, you could say, from the conference, the people we worked to have here. So for me, this is also a very nice image. It's made in Belgium, it's by a Belgian ecologist. My name is Paul Lucan, and it's drawn by Martin. And it's looking at ways to bring in and how to rethink one system to two. So kind of naively, but already in the 80s, which is for me why it's interesting, how to massively bring in vegetation into our different systems, how to rethink energy systems, how to rethink renaturalization. So it's a kind of nice, I think a nice image to understand going from one to another in a simple way. So I'll just go really quickly through these 20 points Bruno and I went through. The idea of this 20 points is kind of to frame a story of what forest urbanism could be, and what it maybe already is in some contexts. Through 20 points, each point had more or less 500 words, sometimes more, a little essay, and an image. So for us, we started just why is forest urbanism interesting? And to understand that forests are really important elements occupation of the earth, and that they always were places of kind of a democratic way of thinking of multiplicity. And for us, the image that really shows that really well is by this Francis Halley, who's a botanist, French botanist. Super beautiful image, I think, of how he draws a forest. And understanding that, very different, I would say, is how architects draw a forest, just like a tree. It's super, it's a multiplicity of tree codes. It has kind of, it has things on the ground, and on mid-ground, and tall, and different. So if we remember back to the notion of succession, so not all forests is all succeeding. The complexity is that you've got some, say, climax forest, but you also have some forest that's maybe just starting and is year zero, and they're always embedded in each other, which of course makes it super interesting. And that's what we want. So we don't never want a kind of all new baby forest. You need the richness of having, say, young forest and old forest as much as we can. But it's more complicated than that, but just quickly giving you the highlight. For us also, we really tried to understand how, if you get rid of boundaries, and just understand bigger occupations of how humans, or how we occupy the world. So once upon a time, we had water and forests, simply put, and we of course changed, because we know we got rid of a lot of forests to do agriculture, and then we got rid of both forest and agriculture for urbanization. So if we take these three, excluding water, which is a system that connects everything, but if we think of these three big occupations of the earth, right? Forestry, agriculture, and urbanization. Urbanization also could include different forms of extraction, in the biggest sense. The kind of plea of forest urbanism is to kind of recreate a balance between these three big things. Because often to get away from the zoning that says this is that, but to know that these things historically, and we propose in the future, should be rewoven. So you shouldn't have just a color in the forest and agriculture, but all three, so forestry, agriculture, and urbanization, big things that occupy the earth, can be rewoven much more into this kind of system of the matrix. For us, we had one image for each aspect. We were trying to find some not so used images. Of course, this is coming from Bruno's history of understanding urbanization in the long history of Europe. So this is an image from, as we see, the 1400s, where we also really understand already this forest in the city, agriculture, co-present. But also for us, understanding, and this is going very much using the categorization of Christophe Giraud, so the man who built the course of landscape architecture. And he says actually that the way we make landscape architecture follows two base topologies. One is to make a clearing in the forest, or a make a walled garden. So those are two types of types. And often we make hybrid of those, but he claims, right, if you talk to many landscape architects, they agree that these are archetypes. You can reduce a lot of projects to one of those two things, or the hybridization of the so using these archetypes, but also as a way to kind of counter particularly colonialism, and a new way to understand different systems. So again, looking at different across different contexts. There's a kind of very well-known group in the Amazon, the Yanomoni, that actually they work as a really quite autonomous in the forest, but they create a clearing and settlement is within that. And of course, prior to that, understanding that, particularly if you look in many, say, more indigenous communities, they weren't only settling carefully in their environment, they often had, like we saw in the Moni, they also had to do often with a kind of cosmological worldview, but they were also acting as stewards. So a steward is someone who takes care of it, right? So they were taking care also of the ecology and of the landscape. So for us, it's really interesting to understand how this could lead to new forms of management, stewardship, and somehow governance. Again, this is for us a super beautiful image of understanding. This is an artist who is looking at the kind of different ways of clearing in a, say, natural forest, but then the cultivated forest and the kind of human-made system, and how it's all very carefully and cleverly done with kind of cultural meanings, but also with providing things that a certain community might want. We know that in many cultures, again across the world, that there's a relationship of different natural elements, whether it's mountains or forest or water, to this kind of notion of a sacred landscape. And so with forests, there's in many cultures the notion of a sacred grove or a sacred forest. So understanding what these are and maybe how we rethink them now. A very kind of canonical example that's well known is in Ethiopia. So Ethiopia has a whole system of, they're called church forests, so spread across the country are a whole series of churches that are always linked to the forest. And where these forests are then cultivated, they're stewarded by that kind of group that lives there. Then we also know that, as we say, if we know these three, urbanization, agriculture, and forestry are kind of the big fights for land. Forests are usually a kind of hedge, if we say the nature-culture relationship there. So nature is there, and culture is what we do to nature. We bring it into culture, often by destroying it. And the forests are often this kind of edge of places that are there. So is there a way we could think of this rethinking this kind of frontier of the forest and the system? Again, this is another artist that for us is also quite interesting, showing how the forest is literally in the landscape system as being logos for other land occupations, even if there are other kinds of forests, where they're all very carefully constructed and existing. Trying to, in this case, understand the non-human life also there and the effect that this clearing and shift might have. Also understand that historically, forests in many contexts around the world were considered commons. Sometimes commons for common, but sometimes collective spaces for royalty, for hunting grounds. But is there a way that we could think of a more contemporary new commons of the forest? I think they're doing this in Japan. Japan has a very active way of conceiving forests and forests for healing mental health and these kinds of things, and how it's can become a new kind of commons. But also when we look back to the long history of forests, a very well-known image is kind of this notion of the hunt in the forest, which is usually a painting, but also how it's part of a kind of common for, in this case, for royalty, for the royal hunt, but as a specific cultural aspect to it. Like so many things, we know that there's kind of been very indigenous ways that relate to culture and ecological knowledge that different groups have developed. But more and more, like most things, we start also getting more classification, and how science is getting its own precision, you know exactly how many blocks from the plant. In scientific forestry, they also start getting more and more precise about which plant where, how many, how to surround it by other plants for disease. If you want to make a productive forest, how to do the clear cutting in the most effective way, still keeping some forests to regenerate the other, so it becomes, and this, the umbrella gets called scientific forestry. Here we see in the early 1900s in Mississippi, where it's a kind of forestry, the measuring, like, so this kind of classification, measurement, understanding started to become part of the whole notion of scientific forestry. If we look in the field of urbanism and the history of urbanism, we also know that we have concepts like the garden city, but for us, forest urbanism is a bit more than that. So it's much more radical, and to think also about agriculture, and also to really again get rid of this monofunctional. But looking back for us, again, this is an image that you know view of looking here in a very nice image from the 15th century, where you see this kind of, in this case, housing for the quite wealthy. This is a painting that the miniature is amongst the forest, you know? So it's this kind of understanding how to nestle, instead of this kind of clearance, how to nestle settlement in. Again, this nation building, we already saw it, I mean, Manu and Chandigarh, etc. We look at systems, you guys have already seen this, thinking of regional systems. Also then we get to part of forest urbanism that's growing more and more as a kind of strategy for urban design, is to think more about urban street trees. But of course it's not new, no? In many parts of Asia, in China, you would have different dynasties where you had to plant trees as by decree. If you cut them down, you had a owner, etc. This for us is a very interesting, say, post-war neighborhood made by a German as a kind of post-war development scheme for kind of suburb, where the kind of street trees and the garden trees all are an important part of the system. Urban forestry as a term is relatively new, it's only a few decades old. So understanding, of course, the trees in the city. For us, a very interesting image is actually from a PhD that was done in TU Delft, so he hasn't found the image, but we eventually got it, of a kind of kampung. So when the Dutch were occupying Indonesia, they were designing kampungs for settlements for local inhabitants. This one is a very interesting one, we thought, because even in this kind of kampungs, which are really usually housing the indigenous community as opposed to the leafy garden suburbs of the colonizers, it was also done with a deliberate system of having trees. Again, this urban forest accounting is very much the Million Tree Program. We want to put more and more trees, we get to do that. And again, what was that out and one's against? So again, coming from Richard Butter, different than here, but showing like how much vegetation we've lost over a certain period of time. Also, what's really interesting in this moment in time is that there's also a lot of breakthroughs in forestry itself, forest science. You've probably heard of Simard, who's talking about the mother tree and how trees speak to each other and support each other underground through the roots and these kinds of things. There's a very interesting man named Stefano Cuso that Masmet is making the Belgian building now in Venice, and it's really understanding the kind of science of the trees. And a lot of it has to do with this unseen so Roger's kind of breakthroughs are really about understanding of the root systems and the underground systems. Another interesting notion for us to understand is this idea of WUI, the Wildland Urban Interface. It's something that was developed in the US, and it looks at kind of area. So if you've got, in this case, a forest, and you've got an urban area, you have an interface, and you can give this interface different indexes. And to know that some are very bad to be next to because of threats of forest fire, etc. But to me, it's a super interesting thing that we have to pay more attention to. And if you think of it as wildland urban interface, not just related to fires, we can think about it in terms of wetland systems. So what is the interface we need between different wildland systems, whether it's wetlands or forest lands or dry lands, to settlement? And of course, this is a fire, to many, but this is introduced in 2017, with the idea is that settlement is giving kudos to this interface and suffering consequences. The whole issue comes up when we build back. Should building back be about, or should it be bad? No? And of course, that's the big struggle. People want to go back to their home or their grandparents, blah, 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 blah. But if you know it's kind of going to be affected by tsunami, by fire, by flood, we also have to manage retreat. So it starts going into these tangents as well. Again, this picks up very much. If we think about urban design strategies, wanting to put trees everywhere, again, maybe we have to know where there's lots and not with them. So this one is very much the thinking that goes like that. And here an example, but this is one project that she criticizes. This is in the American West, during the kind of Dust Bowl, so-called work progress administration WA shelter belt project, built in the 30s, which was basically trying to build a system of forests going from as you see, North Dakota down through Texas. So if you create a band of trees, you can prevent loss and it didn't work. So it's again, because it wasn't basically meant to have trees. So a little bit of that. So then what does all that mean for constructing forest urbanism? So it's really about redefining the bigger system. What is the nature-culture relationship? And that's where we use, again, this is written 5,000 words per point, so a really short system. But here for us, this is a very interesting reconceptualization by Julia Ishigami, a Japanese architect who makes super interesting publications, interesting architecture. So a drawing of a forest with the sort of the bigger circles are the tree canopies, the smaller ones are the trunks. For instance, this is the tree trunk, right? And then this is its canopy. And then he takes this kind of very meticulous drawing, which I have to say, he doesn't give credit, but he borrows a lot from Francis Hallé. If you look in even his sections, he copies Francis Hallé and he doesn't mention Francis Hallé. So those who know, we know. And don't very much, but anyways. But still, it doesn't undermine his brilliance. So he took this measuring of a forest, and then said, what if this is the architecture? What if this is the space for my office? So then he puts his office under the canopy of trees. So trying to adapt the architecture to the forest. So interesting. And then finally, we try to say that the same way when we talked many years ago about water urbanism, it's also given the opportunity to new systems of settlement, but also new technologies of forest, the same, which should give us new ideas of how to make agglomerations, but also units themselves. I recently used an image project from Virginia. If we go to the forest and science, we had 3 scientists In the first one, we coupled Cecil Konanelak together with Kiara Calgary, who's an architect. And basically, he kind of, again, many people are a little critical of this. I am one of them. So as a general rule of thumb, is why Cecil developed it, saying that to explain to a mayor or to explain to that we can have what he calls 330, 300. So it means from every house, you should see 3 trees. Any city, and again, what's your sample square, that's the size of what you're testing. You should have 30% canopy cover, and then you should have 300 meters to the nearest forest. So he generated this based on a lot of other studies of other people, of kind of trying to give quantities and numbers to things. Again, once you make a generic rule, does this work the same in tropical forests? Does it work the same in moderate forests? Does it work the same in boreal forests? Does it work with different cultural ideas and different densities? So that's of course the downfall of kind of one size fits all formula. 2 other scientists, one here, Bart Moos, he's a professor here, I don't know some of you will take his classes. He's a forester, he works in the Department of Earth and Environmental Science. Rick de Vries is another Belgian guy who works at the European level on a series of projects. And basically their whole essay was arguing that, again, we can't just think about quantities of trees, we have to think about the quality of the trees. So always a big tree is much like, we don't give enough attention to big trees. And often when we go and make infrastructure, we cut down big trees, and it's like the loss of a big tree is a big loss, because it takes a long time to make a big tree and for a big tree to grow, but also of all of the kind of richness that it holds within it. So in many cities, there's a kind of outrage when big trees are chopped. And then finally we had a woman who was from Yale University at the kind of School of Forestry, quite well known, and she also works in New Haven, a tough kind of North American city, trying to understand how also trees can be giving social equity, and trying to bring trees to neighborhoods that maybe are a little more underprivileged. That didn't have trees, so she works through the university with the whole tree planting campaign. And quickly I go through a few projects. So I won't go into details of these, but we basically had between 3 and 2-page spreads of different projects. One project, so not kind of a lot of their projects, but one project for different people who found very interesting for this thing. So there's a project at Auschwitz in the center of Paris. Again, creating in a kind of near La France, so creating amongst concrete and concrete jungle, and really a lot of urban stuff. How to create in a kind of minimal space, a little bit like Chris Reed now. How to create a platform that traverses topography, that's a hardscape, but to give space for trees. To again create this pooling system to create in public space. So this got built, as you see, so in this kind of through very clever insistence of the section, and making sure you choose the plant roots, the roots can grow horizontally and not down. So again, having to know what you're talking about to make this really work as a build project. We then included a project of Hongjiangyu. So again, here it's looking at a brownfield site, so a kind of green site that has been used, abused, and how to rethink it as working as in a large city with urban heat island, creating carbon sinks and new public spaces. So typical of Hongjiang is making also these kind of quite choreographed ways that you can lead people through the landscape. But very interesting, I think, was with his work always is that he gives humans some access, privileged access, you could even say, but but then large parts of his sites are not accessible. So it's where he really deals with ecology for ecology's sake, and kind of having this offset again to kind of counter the system of the city. Next example we used was by Atelier Midi. So it's by Joris Moeden. Joris is in the studio review for the Virginia Group, and his partner in the office, Wim Wambek, who's now in Portugal, but they continue their office in Brussels. And this is looking at kind of, say, more typical Flemish system and how to push a forest system. And actually, I have to say that the notion of forest urbanism was coined by Wim Wambek. Together, he did his PhD with Bureau many years ago. We've kind of gone with it since. But this is a project that was part of the commission of the study from the Brussels Meister, the Flemish Ministry. So looking at how in the existing kind of mess of Flemish territory you could push in forest systems and use it as a way to kind of, on the one hand, frame new urban development, but also to re-qualify what you already have. This was a group that didn't present in the conference, but that we invited afterwards. So we found this is a group of landscape architects who were here giving a lecture a few years ago from Brazil, and very interested in the context of Salvador. So where there was kind of, well, Salvador, if you don't know, it's kind of a place where there was a kind of hotbed of exchange from Africa. So it was a part of the whole slavery network, and developed its own very strong African community in Brazil. And they, this group of landscape architects has been working carefully with this group in Salvador and trying to understand also what the kind of forest means for this community, where it has very different kind of small areas that relate to their kind of the sacredness of the forest and different meanings of the forest and small gathering spaces. This is one that is a part of an experiment, interesting office called Effects, that is working across many different scales. What we found interesting here is, personally, not so much the urban structure, which is really much a thing into itself, but really the coexistence of the housing together with the forest in ways, in creating almost Scandinavian, well, they are Scandinavian, they're Danish, but almost Finnish-looking kind of systems of the architecture in the forest. Another woman who was here is Kate Cullity. She's from a firm called TCL, working in this case. This is still a job, but working in the city of Melbourne. Again, city of concrete, how to bring even minimal patches. Again, of forest diversity and different kind of messiness. So I think a lot of architects like order. A lot of landscape architects like messiness, because it's more biologically viable. And that is what I'm going to go into. And then finally, just ending with a few of the young researchers who made papers and presented in the conference. So we have older experts, and then we have papers open for anybody who made a selection. This is a man, this is a man, Bjorn Barka. He presented, he's presently finishing his PhD, super interesting PhD about the non-human. He's doing his PhD in Rotterdam in Ghent, He worked together with Kunran and Marlene, postdocs. So they're responsible also for the redoing of Place Flagey, the image we see here. So Place Flagey is in Brussels, in Ixelles. It was a hardscape, and it's been redone a number of times, and they did the latest version, which is trying to bring more of vegetation. It used to be, when I used to live near here, it was completely car parking, And then it was Peter Lotz made a project that was all hardscape, and now the next iteration, which is this one, is trying to bring a certain amount of culture. This is actually part of an ongoing PhD of a woman named Swargata. She's working in the state of Assam in India with Maya in her PhD. She's actually having her pre-defense during war urbanism, so her final defense hopefully in September. And she looks at these kind of charts, these islands in the river that kind of appear and disappear and grow and shrink because of the kind of braided nature of the river and the way the forests interact in that system. Very, very interesting. A woman named Kamini Gill, she was looking again at this, she's a landscape architect, so this is the way landscape architects draw sections, so a little bit different than the way architects draw them, but understanding also a kind of reforestation in an area of industrial infrastructure. This is a group of two ladies in Colombia that were looking really. So actually, it's very, very funny. They're really hardcore planners, and they were really looking into community forestry and these kinds of things. And they couldn't make drawings. So these drawings are made by previous Colombian students who made her PhD. So she was generous enough to make drawings for these ladies. So it was also kind of nice interaction. So their essay is full of a lot of photographs of people interacting and interviewing. So their topic was really interesting, but we helped them visualize it. So they tried to understand how meeting with different community groups to kind of have local initiatives, similar to what you saw from New Haven, Connecticut. We get into the end here. This is just a crazy guy, Jörg Kika. Jörg is German. He's presently a professor in Dublin, in Ireland. And he's a kind of super critical guy, very, very, very critical, cleverly critical. But he made a big critique on Berlin. So he's from Berlin, and he made a big critique about how it's too much manicured. He's a landscape architect also, and he finds now the whole way Berlin treats its urban forest as being not really urban forest, but as being kind of too pretty, too manicured. So he kind of gives a hard story on that. This is one by a woman, an American. Actually, it was a colleague I used to teach with in Los Angeles, really very clever lady, who made a project using the fog nets. So this is for a competition, and she kind of used this notion of fog nets that we saw last week, but how you could use these grips not to give for agriculture or for drinking water, but actually to grow a forest. So the fence would grow a forest. So it's a kind of, well, they didn't win the competition, but anyways, it was a kind of bold way. And finally, it's a group of, it's a Spanish woman, Maria Bola, who's a professor in Cornell, this other woman, Jamie, and they worked in the area of the Erie Canal. So understanding also how this historic relic of a hardened water system could also be reforested to get it away from its, say, very monocultural systems, and how to deal with global warming, how to deal with heat island. So in that sense, trying to break this monocultural system of forest, urbanism, and agriculture. So yeah, that's, as I say, that book is, if anybody wants it, you can get the whole thing on Leuven University Press as a high resolution. So it's nice. Leuven University Press is now moving more and more towards open access. So it's quite a good system, I think, to be again more democratic and without charging. So it's a good system. So I suggest we have a few minutes break, and then we go through the two books.